we're going to talk a little about polarization and social media. I'd like to ask you to take a quick pre-test, and I tell people from the start, you can't fail. So there's no reason not to. This helps us with quality control, which is a way of saying, I want to make sure this is actually worth your time and the time of people that will do this program again in the future. So if you can scan that QR code, it'll take you to a Google form. My name is Tom Breeden. I'm the pastoral advisor at the One America movement. Who we are is a nonprofit that works with faith communities around the country to address the toxic polarization in our society and bring some healing in the midst of our division. And so that's what brings me here. It's been a pleasure to spend the day with you all. And as I've mentioned, I'm a pastor. I am not a social science researcher. I am definitely not a neuroscience researcher. But a lot of the stuff that we do depends on neuroscience and social science research. And so I always like to give a shout out to our partner organizations that do this kind of research and help us with the data. I'm going to give you some data later in the evening, and it's coming from our friends that have been doing that work. But before we get too into social media and talking about polarization, I think it's good to define our terms, because polarization is a bit of a buzzword now, right? If you read through the news, you will probably encounter a story that is going to mention polarization. And so, what do we mean when we say toxic polarization? Because not all polarization is bad. This is why we distinguish between toxic polarization and normal polarization. Because the reality is, we actually don't want everyone in the country, everyone in our community, to agree on everything all the time. It would be so boring, right? It would be immensely boring if everyone looked at everything the same way and came to the exact same conclusions. And as we look around the world at the countries that have very, very low polarization, chief among that list are countries like North Korea, which I don't know about you, I'm not lining up for North Korean citizenship. So polarization on the face of it is not a bad thing. And so we want to make a difference between normal and toxic polarization. And normal polarization is when we disagree on the issues. It's a matter of perspective. These are the places where we can live and let live. And so I post up pictures of worship styles, right? There's the old kind of church cliche of the worship wars. Are we going to be a praise band church or a choir church? People have their preferences. People have their reasons for why they use the music they use, don't use the music they don't use. But the reality is, we can live and let live on this, right? There are Christians that worship in their congregations primarily with a choir. There are churches that worship with a guitar. And there's room to live and let live. There's room for different perspectives. So what makes polarization toxic? Polarization becomes toxic when it's not about the issues. It becomes about the identity. It becomes about the person. It's no longer just, I don't like what you believe, I don't like your opinion. It's that because of your beliefs and opinions, I don't like you. It's when our disagreements become this matter of good and evil, that one side is the heir of a righteous cause and the other is the villain that has to be stopped. I'm sure none of you can think of current events that would fit that mold. The problem with this kind of polarization is that it gets worse. It escalates, right? Because if I think that my side are the superheroes and your side is the villain, then I'm going to move to defeat the villain. But what happens if I move to defeat your group? Well, you're going to defend yourself from my group, right? And so we get into this escalation where the conflict gets worse and worse and worse, and the sides get more and more extreme. So whereas normal polarization is just the difference of opinions, it's kind of a static disagreement, toxic polarization becomes this downward spiral that gets worse. And so with that, I want to talk a little bit about 3 major myths of toxic polarization. And maybe you're wondering, I'm pretty sure I came here for a social media discussion. Where does social media fit into here? So as we think about toxic polarization, misinformation is one of the factors that increases our division. As we spread things that are not true, as we hear things that are not true, it makes our divisions worse and worse and worse. That's why we've got these 3 myths to talk about. And the thing about social media is that it is a phenomenal vector for misinformation. I mean, you could not design a better system to spread misinformation if you tried than what social media does. And so we're going to talk a little bit about misinformation and these myths in general, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how social media gets involved in that and what we can do. Does that sound good? All right, I'm getting some thumbs up. This is good. All right, good. So, there we go. So let's talk about the first myth. The first myth of toxic polarization is that people across the divide are extreme. The people who disagree with me are extremists. And so I want to show you this data. This comes from our partners at Beyond Conflict that do research on all kinds of current event questions. And what they did in this survey is they asked people who identified as Republicans and Democrats on a scale of 0 to 100 to rank their view on immigration, specifically on the border. And so 0 would mean a completely open border, no restrictions whatsoever. And 100 would be a completely closed border, nobody could get in, no way, no how. And so Beyond Conflict asked these Republicans and Democrats to rank their own view on this scale of 0 to 100. And they also asked them to rank what they thought the other political party would say on the same scale. And this graph shows you what people thought the other side would say. And so Republicans thought that Democrats were almost completely clustered on this one side, and Democrats thought Republicans were completely clustered on the other side. Right? There's this big chasm in the middle. This is what we think our division looks like. But remember, Beyond Conflict also asked what people thought of their own views. So what did that look like? Well, that looked like this. This is a lot messier, isn't it? Now, there's still significant disagreement, right? There's a whole lot of space that doesn't overlap. But we also have this nice big space in the middle. And what I find really interesting is you actually have Republicans and Democrats on opposite sides of the debate than what the prediction would have been. And so what this graph shows us is that we still disagree on things, right? There's still real disagreements in our country, but our divisions are actually a lot messier and more complicated and less extreme than what we think of at first. And so what that means is we can actually have conversations about the stuff we disagree on, right? It's not a lost cause. If we go back and we think this is what's actually reality, well, there's really no point in talking about it, right? There's really no way for these two sides to meet. But if we're here, then we can actually make a connection. And it's not just immigration. I know this is probably rather difficult to see unless you have super good vision, which I would be impressed. But what they've done is they ask the same kinds of questions on a series of different hot button issues. And so this is how Democrats perceive Republicans. The blue dot on this side signifies what Democrats think Republicans would say. And the red on the other side signifies what Republicans actually said. And the big gray bar in between shows the gap between the estimate and reality. And so, on average, Democrats were about 19 points off in predicting Republicans' views. If you think about a scale of 1 to 100, they were about 19 points off when it came to the estimate. But Republicans don't really fare better, right? So if we just flip it the other way and Republicans estimate what Democrats think and Democrats give their actual views, Republicans were on average about 27 points off in predicting what Democrats think. Now, if you are not a data person, maybe at this point you're glazing over a little bit, hearing this like barrage of numbers. What's the point? The point is that we don't actually know people who disagree with us as well as we think we do. We think we've got them figured out, and we think that they fit nicely in that extreme box that we want to put them in. But when we actually get beneath the surface, the truth is actually much messier, and we actually have a lot more agreement than we think we do. All right, so let's talk about this second myth. The second myth of toxic polarization is that people across the divide hate you. And the thing about this perception is that our perception is our reality, whether it's true or not, right? If we think that something is true, we will live as if it's true. Social scientists call this meta-perceptions. Meta-perceptions, brace yourself, is me thinking about you, thinking about me. Did you catch that? It's me thinking about you, thinking about me. And so, let me ask you, we've got this picture here, this BMW with a California license plate that says soccer mom. Let's have a little bit of conversation. What do you think about this person? What do you think you know about this person based on these 3 bits of information? Oh, come on, I know you think you know something. Yeah, a rich mom who doesn't have to work. She goes out for lunch, and she gets to take her kids to soccer. Her schedule's completely flexible, right? What else do we think we know? They don't use signals to change lanes. All right, what else do we think we know? As a Virginian, I'll tell you that's all Maryland drivers, except for the ones that aren't. Yeah. What else do we think we know? Yeah, they've got to be, right? They have to be a leftist. It's a California license plate. Now, this is humorous because we don't really know any of this stuff, right? The reality is we're just being honest about what we're already doing. We make all kinds of assumptions, but really all we know is that she's driving a BMW. We don't know where it came from, right? It could have been a gift. Could have been on Oprah's show and gotten one of those cars for everyone. We don't know, right? I mean, we know this is a soccer mom, but what if it's actually the husband who's driving? What if it's dad who's driving the car, right? He's borrowing his wife's car for the day to run some errands. We see this and immediately we think, I have that person figured out. But often we're mistaken. And here's the thing about these meta-perceptions. What do you do when you think that someone hates you? Now, I know that I am in church, and so somebody is thinking about saying, you turn the other cheek. That's the right answer. But let's be honest, what do we actually do? We find reasons to hate them, right? We create distance between us and them. We avoid them. I'll tell you a story about this in my life. There is a woman who lives in my neighborhood, and we both walk our dogs on almost the exact same schedule. And so what will happen is about the same time, every morning, we will pass each other in more or less the same stretch of road. And every morning, she will pull her dog closer, or she'll go really far out of the way to avoid me. And there's part of me who's thinking, she really doesn't like me. She really doesn't like my dog. What is wrong with her? Now, you see what I'm doing? She could have all kinds of reasons. Maybe her dog's not good with other dogs, and so she doesn't want her dog to be near my dog, right? Keeps everybody safe. Maybe she just doesn't want to get interrupted. She's got her headphones on. I've got my headphones on. I'm immediately assuming that she's giving all this thought about me and that she doesn't like me. And the reality is, she's just going on about her morning schedule. But she and I have never actually had a conversation for me to know what she thinks about me. I just assume. And I'm probably not right. All right, the third myth. People across the divide are less than human. Now, None of us might be quite so bold as to state it that way, but here's what we're talking about. We're talking about dehumanization, or maybe another way you might think about it is objectification. Any way that we can think of another person to make them less of a human being, because then they don't require as much empathy from us. Now, here's the thing about dehumanization. At some level, we all actually do it. And we have to, because if you had the same level of empathy that you had for your spouse or your kids, for every single human being that you encountered every single day, you would wear yourself out. And so we have to have some ability to create distance, right? Surgeons have to create distance between themselves and their patient if they're going to cut in there and do what they need to do, right? Counselors need to be able to create some level of distance so they don't take all of that stuff home with them every single night and just burn themselves out. So this impulse to create a little bit of distance between us and some of the people in our lives is actually a necessary mechanism for us to just stay sane, to stay emotionally engaged in the places where we need to. Where this can go south is when we start dehumanizing whole groups of people. We start kind of writing people off as people we don't need to care about because they vote that other way anyway, or because they have a particular lifestyle, or whatever the metric that we might come up with would be. We think that they would be a lesser person than us, and so require less from us emotionally. And the reason I put up this super pleasant picture of mice is because you can hear this sometimes in our discourse about people, right? Let's go back to immigration as an example. You might hear someone talk about swarms of immigrants at the border. But people don't swarm. Insects swarm, right? And so even that language, that choice of metaphor, is designed to create emotional distance. Because if we don't have that same level of empathy for someone, we may be willing to ignore or even support something that would harm somebody in that group. And so let's think about this. So Beyond Conflict studied this as well. And on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being a primate and 100 being a person, they ask, how civilized do you think your political party is? And how civilized do you think people in the other political party think you are? Right? So how do you think of yourself, and how do you think they think of you? I know that's a word salad. And this is what we found. Now, one of the things I really appreciate is that people across the divide had a little bit of humility. Nobody's really given themselves 100, right? Everyone says, yeah, I'm fairly sophisticated. I'm in the 80 range. But what's interesting is when asked, what do you think people are going to say about you? So ask, what do you think about the group, and then what do you think the group thinks about you? I know that's super messy. Here's what I really want you to see, if you're getting lost in my word salad. The gap between what a group actually thinks about another group and what we think people think about us is huge. The low number is what we expect them to say about us. The high number is what they actually say about us. And so the reality is we don't dehumanize each other. We don't diminish each other's worth and humanity as much as we assume people do. Turns out people don't hate us as much as we think that they hate us. All right, I'm going to keep moving for the sake of time and just summarize this. So the 3 myths: they are extreme, they hate you, and they aren't human, or they're less than human. And it turns out the data shows that none of these things are actually true. How does social media fuel these myths? Where does social media fit into the equation? So let's talk about social media as persuasive technology. we've often heard some kind of version of, if you're not paying for the product is you, right? We've heard something like that. We've heard social media is selling your data. That's close to the truth, but not quite right. By and large, social media companies do not sell the data they collect. What they sell is the promise that they can persuade people to a certain outcome, and they use the data that they've collected to do it. So what does that look like? That's typically going to be advertising, right? If I make red checkered shirts and I want to sell more red checkered shirts, I can go to Facebook and I can say, hey, I want to sell more of these. And Facebook says, great, we have an algorithm using the data we've collected that can get more people to buy your shirts. And they're going to do that. They're going to convince people to buy these shirts because they know exactly who is going to be most susceptible to the advertising, right? They're going to build an audience. They're going to hash all this out with the data they've collected. And then they're going to target specific ads to specific people to get them to do this thing. And so what social media companies are doing is they're selling the promise of persuasion. They've built these platforms to get their users to do something. And typically that's going to be commercial activity, but it could be more than that. It could also be political activity. They could say, well, we want to mobilize voters. We can get political ads to people who are most likely to respond on this issue in this location and get people to vote or not vote, right? To do that kind of thing. And so this is part of the fire that social media platforms have been coming under, is that, do we like the idea that these persuasive technologies can affect our elections? Yeah, I won't comment, but I'm here, so you probably know what I think about that. So social media companies are persuasive technology. Now, what does misinformation have to do with persuasive technology? In order for these platforms to work, in order for them to collect all the data that they need to build their profiles, they need to keep you engaged. They need to keep people using their apps, logging into the website, continuing to come back for more and more. They need that time. And so that means that tech companies need your attention. And so this phrase has come up, the attention economy, right? Think about all of the different commercial forces out there that want your time. Every streaming service under the sun is putting out 10 billion different shows, all of them wanting a slice of your attention. Social media companies are always making changes, always trying to adjust these things to get as much of your attention as they can, because you only have 24 hours in the day. So the question is, how much can these different companies get of that 24 hours? It turns out fake news is a really, really good way to do it. Fake news spreads 6 times faster than true news. And so maybe you're wondering, why? Well, according to researchers, fake news grabs our attention more than authentic information, because for a few different reasons. One is that it often triggers our threat responses, and emotions like anger and fear and disgust, these are powerful. Negative emotions are incredibly powerful, and so a headline that makes you angry is way more likely to get clicks than a headline that is nuanced and thoughtful. And so if you're thinking, I need people's attention, outrage is a great way to get it. Another way that misinformation can spread is just the novelty of it. If something is interesting or unexpected, you might think, I kind of want to check that out. And you can start running down the rabbit hole. This is why conspiracy theories can spread so well on social media, is it's often not necessarily people looking for it. They just see a headline and think, that's kind of weird. I wasn't expecting that. And then they click on it. And when they click on it, the algorithm will say, this is something that engages your attention. Let me give you more. They give you more. And so every time we engage with something that has even a component of misinformation, the attention economy incentivizes these social media platforms to give us more of it. And so an Oxford research study of 22 million tweets showed that Twitter users shared more misinformation, polarizing, and conspiratorial content than they shared actual news stories. And so those myths that we're talking about run all over social media. And as we think about the business structure, the model of these social media platforms, they're actually incentivized to encourage polarization. And so this is one of the things as we kind of hear the debate about regulating social media and how would we make changes, the problem is actually baked into the current business model. Because if they thrive by getting attention and divisive, outrageous, even false things get more attention, then they're always going to be incentivized to spread those things, because that's what's going to drive engagement. All right, well, I have gotten to be the doom and gloom guy up until now, and you've all stuck with me. What can we do about this? Because we're not helpless. There's actually things that we can do. And one of the things I want to say from the outset is that we need to resist simplicity. Because it's really tempting after hearing that data to just say, social media is evil. We have to just get rid of it, and to like go home and have your kids show you their phone as they delete all of their social media apps, right? That might be the tempting thing to do after this. You do you, but I want to suggest that maybe there's more nuanced and, complex ways that we could handle than that. And so some of this is rooted in our Christian theology, right? Because yes, we believe in total depravity. We believe that everything in this world is in some way negatively affected by sin. But we also believe in God's good creation, that everything he has made is good. So when it comes to social media, we have to treat it like we treat anything else. We have to hold both of those truths together in tension. Social media is a created thing that means it ultimately comes from God. And so there's some goodness, and it's also influenced by the fall. And that means there's ugliness. That means there's brokenness at work too. Right? We think about fire. The same fire that cooks dinner also consumes houses. Right? It's a good and a bad. And this is how we relate to technology. And so I want to encourage all of us as we think about what are we going to do about this, to be nuanced and complex in the way that we respond. And on that topic of complexity, if you were with me this morning, you heard me say this: complicate the narrative. This is a phrase I use a lot. Social media is telling us a story. And in fact, some social media platforms actually have a feature called stories, right? Because narratives appeal to us. And so social media, as we consume all the different bits of information that come at us from our newsfeed, it's telling us a story about our country, our neighbors, different groups and communities. It's telling us a story about ourselves. And it's often going to be a polarizing story because, again, that's what's going to motivate that engagement. And so in the way that we use social media, we should look for places to complicate that, to mix up the stereotypes, to challenge those assumptions. And as I think about a prime example of doing this, I'm going to point to Jesus, right? Every pastor has to point to Jesus. Think about what he did with the Good Samaritan story. So as he's laying out this story about what it means to be a neighbor, he takes the people that his audience would have thought are going to be the hero of the story. He made them the villain. And then he took the figure that absolutely would have been the villain if someone else had been telling the story, and Jesus made the Samaritan the hero. Right? He challenged the assumptions of what his audience thought for who's in and who's out. Because that's what the gospel does, right? It challenges our black and white. It challenges our binaries about who's in and who's out. And so we should be people who complicate kind of the simple us versus them narratives. Another important way we relate to social media, as counterintuitive as this might seem, is to take things offline. If you notice when you read the book of Proverbs that sometimes we get conflicting advice, right? Proverbs will say, answer the fool according to his folly, and don't answer the fool according to his folly. Well, how are you supposed to know which one to do? It's the wisdom of the circumstance, right? And so it's really tempting to want to solve our problems online because it's convenient, right? If we have an awkward engagement with somebody in the congregation, it's really easy to just fire off a text message and send it back, or to send something in a direct message. But our digital communication is lacking. I mean, this side of the pandemic, like, we know that, don't we? We know it's not the same as sitting across the table and talking to somebody. And so there's time where digital communication is great and it's convenient. But wisdom also tells us we have to recognize there are times where a conversation is going to be too messy. And then we need to take it more personal. We need to say, hey, let's take this comment thread and shut it down and go get coffee. And we can finish this conversation there. Social media is a tool, but it's not the answer to every communication need. And finally, knowledge is power. I know it's cliche, but it's cliche because it's true. If we know how something works, then we can actually respond to it, right? And so think about these social media platforms. Pastor Tim and I were talking about it just this week. Some of the most brilliant minds in our entire country have gathered to build a platform to get us to do something. How arrogant am I going to be to assume that it has no influence on me? Right? Some level of humility and self-knowledge requires me to say, this might influence me. I should learn how so that I can recognize the signs and I can mitigate some of those effects that I don't want, right? Is my relationship to technology the way that I want it to be? And if it's not, what do I need to change? Jesus says in Matthew chapter 10, verse 16, behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. We can't afford to be naive about social media because it's in all likelihood not going anywhere, right? The toothpaste is out of the tube. So that means we have to be wise, and wisdom requires some knowledge. Take the post test, which you also can't fail. You're welcome. This helps me know as I tweak this, what was useful, what was not useful, where are there gaps that I need to fill in to make this better, because this is an important question. It's not going away, and so we want this training to be as useful to people as possible.